It was around 2002 when I would have been a fresh 13 and in 8th grade. America Online was a big thing, and I had many times gone into chat rooms by myself or with friends to goof around. But unfortunately, unsolicited photos were a thing then too, though you could usually stay clear of it by the chat room you entered. I didn't have any photos of myself back when you had to take a digital photo and upload it from your camera. Plus I was 13 and self-conscious, which I'm sure anyone can relate to. However, one day a guy popped up on my screen wanting to chat. It was fine at first, but I was of course very naive back then. We quickly fell into a pattern of talking. His name was Dave and he lived in California. After conversing for some time, he eventually declared his love for me. Problem was, he was 19. Now I wasn't proud of this, and only being 13, I just sent pictures of some random girl saying it was me, and he instantly fell for me, telling me that age was just a number, and how I was so mature. Now at this point he wasn't living in state, so there was never any chance of us meeting. But eventually he told me that he and his mum were moving up to a city that was about an hour and a half away from me, and started begging me to see him and go to a movie. I had to break the catfishing lie and tell him that the pictures I sent weren't of me, and he was furious. He had been looking forward to a different type of child this whole time, it seemed. Dave forgave me a few days later, saying that he still wanted to meet me because he loved me. All the things you say to a young girl to get her to swoon. And thinking back now, I'm like, wow, I was 13. I told my best friend everything, and that I wanted her to go with me to meet him. There was a whole plan about him driving to see me and going to the movies to finally meet what I thought was the love of my life. But of course I had been brainwashed into believing this was normal. I didn't tell my mom, of course, and honestly she didn't notice any of this was going on to begin with. The day my friend and I were going to meet up with Dave, her mum came and picked us up from school, and she said something that made my stomach drop. "Chrissy, you are not going to the movies, and you are not going to meet that man. You're going to get seriously hurt or kidnapped, and I can't allow you guys to go." I cried and cried because I honestly thought I could handle everything and be fine. She told me she wasn't going to tell my mum, but I had to promise to never speak to him again and never plan to meet a stranger online. He'd shown up and was upset I wasn't there. He went on AIM and flew completely off the handle, like something I hadn't seen at that age, and it scared me. It scared me how close I was to meeting this complete stranger. I kept my promise and never talked to Dave again, but I easily believe I would have been kidnapped or worse that day if my best friend's mum hadn't stepped in. My mum would have been none the wiser. I was none the wiser. But I'm here today and learned a dire lesson. This happened a few years ago, and still rattles me when I think about it. For context, I am a female, and at the time was around 25 years old. I worked in an office of around 150 people, and one day I received an email from a co-worker whose name I didn't recognize. The email basically said something along the lines of, "I'm sorry if I did something to offend you. Given the situation, if you'd prefer never to see me again, I understand and will avoid you in the kitchen." I was totally perplexed as I had no idea who this person was, but I must have done something to offend them, right? I responded with something along the lines of, "I'm sorry if I've offended you. Sometimes I zone out and it can be perceived as being rude, so I apologize." After my response, he started getting irritated, denying my apology and acting all passive-aggressive about it. I wish I had kept a screenshot of these emails, but basically, he was confusing the hell out of me with this misunderstanding. So I sent him a message suggesting we resolve this in person, which was a massive mistake. He agreed to meet in the kitchen in the office, so I went there and immediately saw a tall, 30-ish-year-old guy who I've seen around but never met before. I explained to him that I apologize, but I honestly had no idea who he was, as I'd never even met him before and didn't want any issues. However, what happened after this made me very concerned. His face flushed bright red and he looked visibly angry. He was stuttering and denying that I didn't know who he was, and then said, "You've been staring at me for months. When you made eye contact with me, you gasped and ran away." Okay. What? I strongly denied this and told him he was mistaken, but he kept insisting that I'd been staring at him for months, and he could always see me doing it. Eventually I realized he couldn't see reason and decided to just end the conversation. Upon reflection, I realized that it's possible he thought I was staring at him, because when you walk in the hallway next to the kitchen, there is a room with glass at the end where a bunch of desks are. His desk would be right in the line of sight if I was walking down the hallway, and he had a funny sticker on his desk that I'd sometimes look at. But this seems like a huge stretch. After this incident, a co-worker pulled me aside and asked me why I was talking to him. I explained the situation, and she actually looked scared and went on to tell me that last year he'd appeared in the office in a bathrobe, raving like a madman at people, and he hadn't been fired. Was I dealing with someone in the midst of psychosis? Was he dangerous? I've no clue, but I reported it ASAP to my manager, who took it seriously enough to tell his manager. I don't think he works there anymore, and thankfully I left the company 2 weeks later, but I was extra cautious to not go anywhere near that guy ever again. Last night after a party, a guy who was a friend of a friend offered to drop me home. I was hesitant and wanted to book an Uber, but he insisted on driving me. The problem was, I was feeling quite drunk and out of sorts. When we got to the parking lot, he sat in the car with me, turned off the lights and said he'd wait for a few minutes as he was feeling a little high too. I got scared and said I would get out and wait, but he convinced me not to and kept discouraging me from booking an Uber. Things took a weird turn when he started driving in the wrong direction, assuming I was too intoxicated to notice, but I wasn't. So I asked him to take the correct turns, but he kept taking detours and turning off the GPS. I managed to use my phone to navigate and get us back on track. During the ride, he started complimenting me excessively, talking about how other girls in his life weren't good, but I was different. He seemed to be pushing me into something more, even though I have a long-distance boyfriend. It made me really uncomfortable, and I insisted he take me straight home. After eventually reaching home, I realized he'd left his ID card in my bag, so I wanted to return it to him. But given the weird behavior during the ride, I'm not sure how to do it safely. I don't want to meet him alone again, and our mutual friend has moved to a different state. I understand how there was no need to agree to him offering to drop me off, but the problem is that this was the first time something like this has happened to me, and I didn't know how to be assertive. I just went with it as if I was dealing with a simple friend. But I should have known better. I have learnt my lesson. I ended up dropping the ID off at a friend's place and told him to take it from there. He seemed to be a little ashamed of what had happened and asked me to hang out again. But I mentioned that he'd gotten a little too drunk that night, told him where his ID was, then just blocked him. My parents divorced in 2006 when I was 17, which was right before their 18-year anniversary. It was a long time coming. My dad had sustained a head injury 4 years prior, so his drinking and drug use went from a lot to a cyclone of crazy. So my mum risked it and left him. It was my dad who moved out, and we remained in the same house in a small city close to our state's capital, having moved from a small town. It was weird. However, the first month he'd been gone was very peaceful, and we never knew it could be so much so. I remember feeling actually free for the first time in my life. My dad had to be supervised by state police when he collected his stuff, as he could become violent, and had actually threatened to kill me on several occasions. He never cleared out the basement but left all his garbage, so my mum, myself and some friends helped the clean-up effort, and we ended up getting around $200 in returns from all the beer cans. My friends and I collected different pieces of furniture, some musical instruments, stereos, and a fridge so we could put soda and beers in there as we took over the garage and basement. My friends and I discovered my dad had been growing weed in there too, as he'd left all of his plants and equipment behind, and at the time it was illegal in my state. Now my mum has a job where she could easily get fired and lose her driver's license, so my friends and I didn't want to get involved with selling any of it. We honestly were just interested in having fun, but on our terms. We liked to have a drink, but beyond that it never got into anything more, so we threw it all out. My dad had told us he'd taken everything, so that was that, and I would never have to interact with him again, as he'd given me up during the family court stuff too. Or so we thought. Now our house is on a hill, and it borders the actual city, which has alleyway access that leads to our small backyard. The basement access was outside only, and was kept with a padlock, and the door itself was pretty sturdy. The house was next to a diner and a storage garage, so everything closed after 5 p.m. And there were other houses on the street, and it's the main drag that connects you to a small highway. I don't remember when it all started, but I recall my dad would phone our house nightly, drunk, and accused my mum of cheating, and he was already living with another woman. He would call up crying and belligerent some nights, and then we began getting people prowling around the house. It started very subtly, until my special needs sister started seeing a ski-masked man at her window. I would often on a night have to chase someone away with a bat, and whilst I was home alone or watching my sister, as my mum had to work multiple jobs, I started working as well, but most nights I would wait up and patrol our property to make sure everyone was safe. I developed a good layer of trauma from all this, as well as a caffeine addiction, as to always be on alert. I had suspected it was a few of my dad's friends that was terrorizing us, especially since they had been interested in the basement. I'm also not a small person. I had given up playing football and had trained to play for a D1 school, so I was still fresh from it all and was still very fit and strong. One night in particular, I remember being awoken by my bedroom window being tampered with. I looked over and saw a man in a ski mask trying to pry open my window, and he had a large hunting knife in his mouth. I slipped out of bed and onto the floor, then crawled out of my room and into the living room. I grabbed a Louisville slugger that I kept by the front door. Then I got my shoes and jacket on as it was winter and snuck outside. I confronted the man who I recognized as one of my dad's friends, and he started talking crap, making fun of me as I warned him he needed to leave or I would hurt him. He took a swing at me with the knife and I pulled back, cracking him on his shoulder as hard as I could, hearing his bones breaking. I watched his shoulder move in an unnatural way as he fell down in the snow. So I got on top of him and started punching him over and over, removing the ski mask. My mum came out and so did our neighbours, just as the guy had stopped moving, as he was now unconscious. It took my mum and 5 others to pull me off him, and they had a hard time. As we waited for the cops, he came to and managed to get up. He tried to run but was having a hard time. But just then a car came, he hopped in, and it took off before we could stop him. We all gave our version of what happened. The cops took his knife as evidence, and that was that. Things were quiet for a while before it all started up again that summer, and I had cornered the same guy one night in our small yard. He yelled that he wanted his equipment from the basement, but I told him we'd tossed it out. Then he charged me. I picked up a large garden brick and tossed it towards him, hitting him in the same place I did months prior. I heard his bones breaking again, and this time I sat on him as he kicked and screamed whilst my mum called the cops, and they came and actually arrested him. They told me that I had broken his collarbone and that he wanted to press charges, but nothing ever came of it, after which the whole situation ended up blowing over and it all stopped. My dad admitted he was involved and wasn't sorry that he'd pitted these men against his kids and ex-wife, which of course has altered my relationship with him. I saw the man during the pandemic, as our city had a lot of public gatherings, and while I'm not the same person, I was very happy to see him have a level of healthy fear. Also, another one of the guys involved that I had run into as well was very cautious around me and referenced that he didn't want me to do what he'd done to his friend. A few years back, when I was around 18, I entered a very rebellious phase in my life. I have always been a prodigy child, always did as I was told, never stayed out late, didn't smoke, didn't drink, and scored the highest in all my classes. All my family, my friends, and my friends' families thought I was the perfect kid. But then something changed. I was on a lot of medication due to my health, and I started going through bouts of depression. I started acting up like never before, stopped going to school, stayed in bed all day, didn't talk to anyone, and then gradually I started talking to strangers online. Initially it was just talking to them. I would talk to a few people till I found someone interesting, then I would dedicate all my time talking to them until they no longer held my interest. I'd then move on to the next person, and this went on for about a year. Then I eventually started meeting these people in person. Most of these meetings were sexual, and I was very reckless. I slept around with more people than I'd like to admit, and regardless of my lack of concern for my own safety, I somehow never met anyone that had any evil intentions. We'd meet a couple of times, do the dirty, and that was that. That is until I met this one guy. I was talking to a couple of guys at that time and wasn't in any sort of relationship, just being a hoe. So this guy started talking to me and asked me about my hobbies, my interests, and what I do, and I told him I didn't smoke or drink, and he was shocked. I told him it wasn't that I'd never done it. I had tried it, but just felt like it wasn't my thing. We talked for a couple of weeks, and I told him about how I've been going through depression. At first he just listened, and eventually started telling me I should try smoking. It would help me relieve my anxiety and stress. I always turned it down, but he was relentless. After a month or so of talking online, we decided to meet up in person. We had never had any sort of sexual conversation or anything, so we're just going to meet as friends. I was supposed to meet another guy, an acquaintance for something I needed, so I suggested to the online chat guy that we meet briefly for lunch, and then he can drop me off at the other guy's place. He agreed, and we decided on where and when to go. The day we were supposed to meet, we met at a local cafe. We had brunch, and then I got in his car for him to drop me off. It was a good 45-minute drive, so I put on some songs and decided to relax. When 5 minutes into the drive, he offered me a cigarette. I declined, but he insisted and kept insisting till I gave in and agreed. I opened the box and there was only one cigarette in there though, so I told him it was his last one and asked if he was sure he wanted me to smoke it since he would have enjoyed it more than me. He said yes, so I took the cigarette out and there was something odd about it. It didn't look like it was a store-bought. It rather looked like it had been rolled by hand. But then again, I had never smoked enough cigarettes to be sure, so I lit it up and began smoking it. I couldn't even smoke half of it, as it made me inexplicably nauseous. I gave up and offered it to him, but instead of smoking it, he put it out and threw it away. I thought it was weird, but assumed he probably didn't want to smoke while driving. 30 minutes into the ride, I started feeling really sick. My whole body was shaking, and I could barely keep my eyes open. I kept telling him I wasn't feeling good, and that maybe we should go to the nearest ER, but he kept telling me to relax and lay back. Absolutely everything about that ride felt off. I told him to stop the car and drop me off wherever we were, but he still refused. All I could think of was pulling out my phone and calling the police, but when he noticed what I was doing, he thankfully immediately stopped the car, and I finally got out. I couldn't stand up, so I sat on the roadside and called the guy I was supposed to be visiting. He immediately drove to me, picked me up and took me to his place, where I threw up all over his living room, multiple times. For the next hour and a half, I laid on the couch, my whole body shaking and constantly throwing up. My friend brought me water, gave me some electrolytes and kept insisting on going to the hospital, but I didn't want to. I had no idea what I had smoked, but I'm adamant it wasn't just a plain old cigarette. I was scared of it being some illegal drug, and if the hospital had caught on, I would get into trouble. I also absolutely did not want my parents to find out what I'd been up to, so I laid there still throwing up and letting whatever that stuff was to get out of my system. All these years later, I am now married to the guy who picked me up from the roadside and helped me through an insanely embarrassing time. And to the guy that laced my cigarette, let's not meet. I, a 34-year-old female, was out and about yesterday with my 2-year-old daughter, and we stopped by my local bank at around 11:30 a.m. It was business as usual as I began to put my daughter into her car seat, which was located roadside, and as I looked up I saw a man, slim build, medium height, possibly Indian descent, and he was walking in my direction. He was dragging his leg behind him as if he was injured. I continued buckling my daughter into her overly complicated car seat, when suddenly I looked up to see this man standing at the opposite side of my car. I automatically assumed that he was fixing his shoelace, picking something up, or maybe looking for directions. And then he spoke, but I missed what he'd said. "Sorry," I muttered, looking anxious and surprised. "This bag is heavy." He raised his left arm to reveal a large black bag. I just smiled and pretended to adjust the car seat straps that had been secured for the last 2 minutes now. "I could use a lift with this heavy bag," he insisted. I pretended I couldn't hear him as my gut was screaming at me at this point. I felt this was really wrong and something was about to happen. He then took out a cigarette, lit it up and leaned against my car as if he were the proud owner of my little Hyundai, or as if we were old buddies catching up. Feeling very on edge and just wanting to get out of there, I demanded, "Can I help you?" The area I was in was very quiet and had very little cars around. I was right outside the bank, but what were they going to do? I froze. He smirked and said, "If you come over to this side of the car, I must tell you that I have a habit of touching women's breasts," and he laughed to himself. "If you touch me, I'll scream," I exclaimed. In the next few moments I thought, okay, so if I walk around to the other side, he could grab my keys and drive off with my baby. But what if I stick the keys in his eyes? But what if he overpowers me? Maybe I could kick and bite him and scream. What if he has a gun or knife in that bag though? Maybe I should take my daughter out and we walk back inside the bank. But what if he grabs her and runs off? My brain was spinning with what to do in those few moments. Just then I noticed a man walking towards us on the same side of the road as this creep, so I raised my hand and waved at him. The man looked confused and I called out, "Excuse me, sorry," as he made his way over, and my new friend ran away, fast, and suddenly didn't have a bad leg. I told the man what had happened, and he advised me to go to the police and make a statement, which I did. I honestly never expected such a thing to happen, especially during the day. It really shook me, and I spent most of the day having what-if thoughts. Be careful out there, guys, and creepy man with the black leg and the injured leg. Let's never, ever in this lifetime meet again. This was a few years ago now when I was 23 years old. I'm a female and was leaving my apartment on a Thursday night at 11 p.m. to pick up my boyfriend from work, which was downtown in a large city. I left my place out through the back exit to the alleyway where I parked, when I noticed a car with its lights on, parked up to the right of me. This was not unusual, as security for a nearby 24-hour store would use this spot on slow nights. So I got into my car, I had backed in, and the car I had seen had blocked me in. At first I was incredibly confused. Then a man got out and gestured to a gun in his pocket. Here's where people would say I could have done so many things, like in a horror movie where you know better, but they just walked towards the danger. But I froze. All I could do is say no and lock my doors. I could have hit the panic button by driving into him, pinning him to his car. But all I could say was, no, fuck off. After what felt like an hour, he thankfully left. But now having a chance to think, the complex is built in a U-shape around our parking lot. If I had made a commotion, people would have come, but he simply drove to the next spot over and parked up. I sped off and called 911, reporting that I think I just got held up at gunpoint. I was still in shock and never actually saw a gun, so they took my claim with a pinch of salt and said that they would have extra patrol in my area. All I knew is that it was a green 4-door car, and he was a white man with a beard. I picked up my boyfriend and we came home. A week later is where this story takes a turn. Now, I usually picked up some weed, which was legal and for my anxiety, every Thursday. I hadn't done the previous week, and when I called in this week, they informed me that I could not have friends call and order in my name. This was when a medical card was required. They let me know that a man had given my full name, date of birth, and home address to the only place I ordered from at my usual time. They explained that a Middle Eastern man with no beard had accepted the delivery. So I asked when this was, and they said around 11 p.m. the previous Thursday, in front of my apartment. I first asked who the driver was, as I knew them all, then explained my situation and asked for the number that had called. I was able to talk to the driver, who explained to me that a different vehicle and man had picked up my $10 order out the front of my building. I then reverse searched the number and found the man who had held up my car. I found him on Facebook, and he worked at Walmart 30 minutes away, and his Facebook was riddled with photos of automatic rifles. I called the police and explained all of this, but they did absolutely nothing. I just want to state now that I am still very grateful for my sister's actions. This happened some time back when I was around 8 or 9 years old, when my family and I had gone on vacation. We decided to go to Spain for the first time, and during the season we went there, we encountered some really hot weather, which we all were really unaccustomed to. But we tried to make the most of it as we were only there for a few nights. So during the daytime, we tried to Tetris our schedule with visiting sightseeing stuff and museums, and visiting smaller towns and such. On the evening this happened, my family and I had spent the whole day being out and about, visiting some nearby areas by bus and walking around, etc. And I'm someone who gets quite uncomfortable in really warm temperatures, which I only discovered on this vacation, and my energy levels were at an absolute low. We were on the bus on our way back to our hotel, and I just remember feeling so exhausted to the point where I just wanted to lie down, but there were no available seats on the bus. So my family and I all stood huddled together when I noticed that a window was cracked open a few seats away from us. I told them that I would prefer standing over by the window to help me cool down, so I went over there, leaned against the glass and closed my eyes, enjoying the occasional breeze that would come in through the window. I don't remember how long I'd been standing there. I was just focusing on every puff of wind coming through, when just then I felt my sister sharply grab my arm and drag me back towards where my family were standing. I looked up at her and she had this very stern look on her face. She was glaring at someone on the bus. I tried to see who she was looking at, but I couldn't tell. The whole rest of the ride she kept her arm around my shoulder tightly, and I asked her what she was doing, but she just told me that it was nothing and kept on having this weird look on her face. About 15 minutes later, when we got off the bus, I asked her again why she'd pulled me back like that, and she told me that some guy that had come onto the bus stood at the very front and started looking at me. She noticed this immediately and kept her eye on him. He was looking me up and down, then began making his way towards me, a few steps at a time. There were a good few meters between me and him from where he'd initially stood, but his constant eyeing of me and looking at the people around me made her think that he was trying to scout if I was alone or not, and he just hadn't noticed my sister glaring at him. At first she thought he was looking at me due to how fatigued I looked, but his constant small steps towards me made her feel really uneasy. He was about 2 meters away from me when she decided to quickly step forward and drag me back to where the rest of my family were. Apparently the guy just suddenly started peering out the nearby window, pretending like it had started raining or something, and never once glanced back at us for the rest of the entire ride, until he got off at his stop, which was about 10 minutes after this whole ordeal. My sister doesn't like talking about it at all. She's still not sure if he had malicious intent. But regardless, she's glad she acted, even if it was just her being overly cautious. I'm really happy she decided to be safe rather than sorry, and I don't even know what the man looked like, as I never saw him. This happened about 30 years ago, in a small town about 10 minutes outside of Atlantic City. I was about 25 at the time, and my mum was in her mid-50s. It was a week or so before Christmas, and my mum asked if I wanted to go with her to a small shop so she could pick up a few things. I agreed and even offered to drive. We pulled into the parking lot and parked facing a stockade fence, the kind that were all the rage in the 80s and 90s. This lot was bordered by the small, barely 2-lane street on the side we entered on, and a 4-lane highway on the other side. The lot served as a Chinese restaurant, a deli, a pizzeria, the shop we were stopping in, and a few other businesses. It was around 6 p.m, so only the pizzeria, the restaurant and the shop were open, so there were very few cars around. The first 3 spots on either end were handicap spaces, so I parked further down, in one of about 8 spots between the handicap spots. We got out of the car and had only gone a few steps towards the street, when a man I would guess was in his late 30s, early 40s, walked out from between a couple of cars. My spider sense went to full alert immediately. He took a couple of steps towards us, looked right at us and said, "I fucking hate people like you," in a low, menacing voice. I instinctively took a step to my side to place myself between him and my mum. "Like what?" I said. "People that park in handicap spots," he said, nodding behind me. I had grown up in this town. I rode my bike here all the time as a kid, and was here quite often as an adult. I knew for sure that I wasn't in one of those spots. I had even parked a few spaces further in, since neither me or my mum had mobility issues. "I'm not in a handicapped spot," I said confidently. This time the man pointed over my shoulder, grew agitated and said, "Yes, you are. Look." It was then that I realized that he knew we weren't parked in a handicapped spot, but he was trying to get me to turn around. I don't know what his intentions were. I'm a pretty big guy at 6'1", 200+ pounds. I'm not sure if he had a weapon or just wanted to distract me so he could get the jump, maybe snatch my mum's purse. But either way, I decided that rather than confront him directly, I would play a little game back. I drove a Chrysler, and back then the keys were topped with a black plastic pentagon with the Dodge logo stamped onto it. I curled my fist around the plastic head of the key, with the metal part sticking out a couple of inches between my pointer and middle fingers, so that if one were to be punched in the eye, well, they wouldn't have an eye after that. I held my hand up and pointed over my shoulder with the metal part of the key and said, "There's no sign on that spot." His eyes flashed from behind me to the key protruding from between my fingers back to my eyes. I flashed my eyes to the key, lowered my hand slightly, then met his gaze. My mum was behind me saying something I don't recall, and this game of chicken between me and the guy went on for about 3 to 4 seconds. It felt like 5 minutes, before he said, "Whatever, fuck you," and walks away towards the highway at the opposite end of the parking lot. I watched him leave before turning around, and sure enough, there were at least 3 spots between my car and the handicap spot. He was 100% trying to distract me. He was so matter-of-fact that as he walked towards the store, my mum was wondering what he was going on about. I told her that he was trying to get us, to turn around. The second time when he pointed, my mum said she turned around, even though she knew we weren't parked in a handicap spot. I'm glad I trusted my instincts. It's not the first time my spider sense was right, but that's another story for another day. I was living on the Fiji Islands back in 2016, and I was 14 years old when this story happened to my family, mainly my mum. It was on the 31st of October, and I was at school for a Halloween party. My parents and my little sister were at a family friend's party, so the house was empty. My party finished at 9 p.m, and my dad came to pick me up, but he dropped off my mum and sister at the house because our security alarm was going off. Because nobody was home, my family obviously called the security company over, and they sent a van with 3 guards. My mum opened the front door and let everyone in, and they checked the whole house to see no one. My mother checked all the cupboards and under the bed with my little sister, who was only 12 at the time, and the security guys went outside into the garden and into the basement to check if there was anyone there, and if the alarm hadn't accidentally been tripped. My mum turned on all the lights from the living room and the balcony and began opening the windows and the gates that protect all the windows to get onto the balcony. But when she looked at the keyhole to unlock it, she saw flip-flops on the floor. Looking closer, she could see 2 pairs of legs hiding really close to each other against the wall under a garden sofa. My mum yelled at the top of her lungs, "They're on the balcony!" And the 2 guys got scared and jumped off the side into the garden. One of the guards managed to grab one of them, but the second intruder jumped on the guard, releasing his buddy, and they both ran away, jumping over the fence and into the forest. My mother regrets yelling. As if she had just come down and quietly spoken to the security, the guys wouldn't have run and would have probably been caught. My mother cried, holding my sister to her side and reassuring her that everything would be okay. Then the security called the police, and they did a report describing the guys and started a search. The cops arrived in a minute, as I live around 100 meters from the closest station. The guys who jumped had left a hat, a pair of flip-flops and some socks that they used as gloves, and there were also 2 knives. One of them had also taken a dump in the garden, but sadly they were never found again. However, 2 weeks later, my mum pulled out of the driveway, and looking in the rearview mirror, she's 90% sure she could see the 2 guys opposite our house staring at her. The short one had the same new hat, and the other guy had brand new flip-flops. When my mum drove away to the police station, the guys were gone and were never to be found again. I got home later with my dad to my mum and sister crying. We feel so lucky that my mum had spotted them before she'd opened the window. Otherwise, what could have happened? How did the 2 guys get on the balcony in the first place? It's going to sound stupid, but right next to the balcony where they were hiding, there are 2 wooden poles linked with a weird plank. We don't use it for anything, it's just there. My dad has asked the landlord to get rid of it, but he didn't want to for some reason. But I used to use it when I was around 15 or 16, when I was already 6 foot, so I could jump and climb onto my balcony to sneak out to see my girlfriend. I'm now 21 and live in Australia, and even though I didn't experience this for myself, it really scared me, because I was young. And now that I live alone, I check the entirety of my house and make sure it is always locked, to the point I lock myself out of my house way too many times. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed the stories in this episode. Please let me know what your views are, and hit that like and subscribe button. Until next time, keep being creepy.